you, Raina. Thank you. Okay, let me see. I have a message here. Okay. Raina, I have a message on my screen. Okay, it's gone. Okay, now we're ready. So thank you so much for being here, guys. My name is Julia Perugini, and I'm so happy to be able to be with you guys one more time for this class, and we're gonna make some cute cookies. We basically gonna work with some of the most popular sweet Sugarbelles colors that right now, especially because Easter, because spring, right? Springtime. And this is one of my favorite shapes. So just a little bit about me. I am a baker. I am specialized in cookies. I'm a cookie creator. I do a lot of videos and a lot of tutorials. You guys can follow me on Instagram. I think that we're gonna have the handle there later. And if you have any questions, please put on the chat, and then we're gonna try to go over the questions that you guys have, okay? So no more delays, and we're gonna start with the beautiful flower. So this is, I think you guys have saw examples, right? And I'm going to show you the picture there. This is Sweet Sugarbelle design, which is so cute and so, it's not a difficult to follow design. It's a design that anybody can do with a little bit of practicing. And I think it fits for so many different situations and parties and, you know, events that you can do. Flowers are great. So this is the shape. And you guys should have in your list. One of they have, I forget what is the set that comes in because I have all of them, but this is one of the shapes that we're gonna use today. And then we have also this other flower. We're gonna try to go to it. As you know, hopefully we can do a lot more than just 2 cookies, but let's see where we at, okay? And so the first thing that we're gonna go over is the icing. We're gonna go direct to the cookies itself, to decorating. But I can tell you that Sweet Sugarbelle if you haven't seen, you gotta go. Her blog is amazing. On her website, I think we can also put the link. And she have guide for icing and recipe for cookies, and it's amazing. I recommend you guys take a look and follow those recipes, because honestly, still to this day, I do a lot of hair recipes and I follow a lot because she knows a lot. And so it's always helpful. So for the flower that we're going to start today, we usually, and I know that Callie, you know, Sweet Sugarbelle, that she always do that too. We usually mostly work with 2 consistency icings. So we have the piping, which is the icing that is more creamy and holds the shape. So when we say piping icing, we expect the icing that you're gonna pipe and it's gonna hold the shape. And I'm gonna show you. And the second consistency is gonna be a little bit more liquid, and it's gonna be a little bit more easy to work on the cookie when we're flooding the cookie. So we work with 2 consistencies usually. For this design, we're gonna try to start with the white, because we're gonna try to do similar to what we have there on the ad. So pipe consistency, and I have the white. You can have any color. I have the red, the orange, I have a pink, and I have green. That's what I chose to work with, but you can use any color, purple, yellow, whatever you like. So we're gonna start with this, and this is what I meant when I say I'm gonna do in the middle of the cookie so you guys can see, but it's not how it goes. But you see, when I make the line, it's holding the shape. So it's not spreading, right? Because this is a pipey consistency. So now, let me get my paper here. I'm gonna clean, and we have this little tool, which is also from Sweet Sugarbelle, and you find in Michael's. Helps me clean, okay? And that's a great thing about icing. You can always clean and do again if it doesn't look good. And I'm gonna start by outlining the cookie. Let me see, I think I'm gonna make this, I'm working with a chipless bag, which means I don't have the little metal chip. You can always use them. Sometimes I use them, sometimes I don't. But if you're a beginner, you might want to use that so you can get used to the right thickness for your project. So I'm going to start by piping the outline, and note that I'm not touching the cookie until the end of whatever part I'm working on. So when you're working with piping and when you going go into the outlines, you don't want to touch the cookie. Icing is very flexible. See, I can even rise a little bit, because this way gives me a better view and better control. And I just touch the cookie at the end. Touch the cookie when you want to stop. So that gives you the pause that you need. Let's do one more. And then you can ask me, what happens if we make a mistake? Dun, 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 dun. Same thing, icing is great. I'm just gonna, I think this one looks good, but I just want to show you guys, if you made a mistake, do not freak out, okay? Just go ahead and clean. Isn't it great that you can, if everything in life was this easy, that you can just clean and do again, just erase and do again. Do we have any questions so far, girls? Rina, do we have any?
Nope, not yet.
Okay, I'm gonna do over just to show. All right. And you guys can also type on the chat where you guys are watching from. Where you guys at? I am in Arizona, by the way. And it's not hot today, believe it or not. In the 70s. But next month, it's gonna be so hot. And then if you guys wanna visit me, I recommend you come after the summer, because nobody wants to be here when it's hot. So this is the first. And I'm gonna, let's do pink. No, let's do red. So now I have the icing that is going to cover the whole cookie. It's a little bit more liquid. And now that's how I do it. I like to start from the edge. And I usually go around the whole cookie. And if you work with the icing that is about 15 seconds consistency, the 15 seconds that I'm talking about is how long it takes for the icing to spread on its own and for any peak to disappear from the icing. You see this icing is liquid enough that is spreading itself. I don't have to do much. I like to work with icings that are a little bit more liquid, because I think it just works so well and doesn't give you too much work. You don't have to be with your scrubbing tool fixing too much. Sometimes you do, but, and then pro tip here, if you guys don't have one, I do have one here, I'm gonna show. It's not advertising because I don't know where it comes from. I think I bought from the dollar store or something, but this is a little fan. I usually dry my cookies with a fan because it gives the cookie a shiny finish. So anytime that I make my cookies and I'm gonna leave this cookie to dry a little bit, I just put it under the fan, and that way it dries so much shine. I think I put so much ice in this corner here. I'm sorry. Let me get it. Okay, and this first step is done. So I'm gonna move my cookie to my side little table here. You guys aren't gonna see for a while because I'm gonna just dry this cookie, okay? Let me put the fan close to it. If it is too noisy, you guys can let me know and I turn it off. But like I say, I like to dry my cookie under the fan. It gives a better finish. And that is a pro tip, like I say. This cookie has a few extra designs. Oops, that is gonna be this nice effect, and it looks like actually flour. But that, let it dry, let that one dry for a little bit. I'm gonna do one more. Let me see, something in my cookie. And so I'm gonna do one more. If you guys baked your cookies and you guys decorate with me, let me know if I'm going too fast. Okay, let me go again. Do not touch the cookie. Try to keep your piping tip a little bit up in the air. I don't know if you guys can see how up in the air I am, but you cannot. Don't be afraid. Lift your icing a little bit because it's going to give you more control, and especially when you're doing circles. A lot of people ask me how you can get nice round shapes, right? That is the secret. Keep your bag elevated a little bit, because if you're too close to the cookie, it's difficult to get control when you're making circles, okay?
So we do have a question from Jackie.
Okay.
And they want to know, how long does it take for the flooding to dry typically?
That great question, by the way, Jackie. It depends. Depends on your environment. Like I'm in Arizona, it's super dry. It will dry faster. I usually let my cookies dry at least 8 hours. It depends where you are. If you're in Florida, it might, take longer for you because it's humid. If you live under the fan, it helps you go faster. But let's say if I'm gonna go from one step to the next step, like now, I maybe wait a few minutes, maybe up to an hour, depending on the next step. If it's just like the designs in the middle, like we're gonna do for this one, you don't need to dry for hours, maybe a few minutes under the fan, it's gonna be fine. But you wanna wait a little bit between steps so you don't bleed the cookie. But what the bleed means, the colors to mix together, right? Because if you're working, especially if you're working with red and white, you wanna give a little bit time between steps, because we know red is super dark and white is white. Then you wanna give a little bit more time to the white to dry or the red to dry. Here, I'm gonna do now because we're in a class. But in real life, if I was making this cookie, I would give maybe half hour for the white before I go to the red, okay? I hope that helps, but total dry time, I would say between 8 and 12 hours, depending on the environment that you're at. Hope that helps. So now let me do the same thing for the pink. Let me see a few. So I like to, even I like to go around like this and just fill in, or I try to go in the same sequence, like from the top to the bottom. I'm gonna have to move this one a little bit because I put a little bit less icing, because the red one, I put too much icing. Guess what? The icing is overflowing my cookie, which is fine. You can fix that, but it's better if it doesn't happen, right? So that's how this one is. And we're gonna wait a little bit. Oh, I see, oh my goodness, I think I drop a little crumbs on my cookies, and I have a little bubble. Air is the one, no, icing has two enemies, water and air. So if you will see a little bit bubble of air, you wanna pop that, looks nicer. And if you have water, don't let drop on your icing, because that will destroy your cookie. Okay, so let me move this one to the side. So we need the icing to dry a little bit before we go to the next step. So what I'm gonna do here, okay. So what I'm gonna do here now is I'm gonna outline the next cookie. And this is the little flower. Those cookie cutters, the nice thing about those cookie cutters, they're so, like, we still, every time that I look at them and I think a little bit, I find out some other way to use. Like we have this one that was like the bunny shape, right? It's a bunny shape. And now is a backside of a bunny, right? So all those cookie cutters from Sugarbelle, they are so easy to flip using other ways. So it's a good investment to have them. And this one also, I see people use making it a wedding dress, right? A little fairy dress, a little bell, but it's spring, we're gonna make a flower. And I think I'm gonna use the orange. Again, like I said, I don't have a piping tip, but you can use it. If you're a beginner, it's a good idea. And if you're not a beginner, it's a good idea, but I don't know, I used to not use many of them, mostly because I'm lazy to wash them, to be honest, guys, don't tell anybody, but the piping tip is a good idea. Okay, so here. I'm gonna outline. And I forget the name of this flower that have the shape. Anybody can help me? As you can tell, my memory is not good. I'm pregnant as well. So they say when you're pregnant, your memory is not good. I'm starting to believe in that. Okay,
It's called baby brain and it never goes away.
So I'm on my second one. So that means it's just going down the hill.
It's getting exponentially worse.
It's gonna get worse, yes. Oh my goodness. Yep, if you have babies, you know. If you don't have babies, you know someone that have babies, you know too. Okay, so let me just fix this one. Oh, look, I made a mistake here because I was talking too much as usually. And I went down a little bit here. But great thing that we can clean icing and do over and nobody never gonna know. How good is that? So for this one, let's say if you wanna wait a little bit to dry, you can give a few minutes and this can dry. In the meantime, I'm gonna show you guys another pro tip. So there's also another pipe chipless bag. If you say you don't have, we have the leaf chips, you can find in Michael's for sure. But if you don't have it, or if you can find it, like I misplace things all day, every day. This is how you make exactly the same effect of the leaf tip. You're gonna cut a little, like a little V. Okay. I don't know if you can see, but maybe you can put something in the color below here. I don't know. It's like a little V. But I show you what happens. Let me get a little, what's my little, I also have like little papers that I use to demonstrate things. I don't know if that's a good idea, but that's how I have been. So let's say if you have this cotton like that, you can try to make leaves, right? And that is free for this one, because you don't have to have an extra tip. But if you have the tip, it's easier for you. If you don't, so, and that's how we're gonna make this here. So I'm gonna start like this. To make the little leaf. Because this leaf is like longer, I gotta kind of move. And then you go with the motion. And I'm gonna go and do one more time, not in this cookie. I don't wanna, mess up the cookie, but let me get this little carrot from the stackable set from Sugarbelle, and I'm gonna make the little leaf here for you guys to see. Up and down, and pull out. Up and down, and pull out. And you have a little leaf. Is that cool or what? And if you don't have tip for that day, is that it's a good idea of how to make. We can finish this. I think we can finish this one since we have the orange here anyway. That was so fun, like I said, the stackable set. I'm gonna outline my little carrot. This is so adorable. Let's guy can go for this guy. Right? That's cute. So let me put this one down. I actually made, just remember, I made a video of this one. I can post it. It's just a little tutorial to show you how to make this one. Okay, so let me just clean this. Let me go back with this little flower. Let's finish up. Love the consistency, which is a little bit more liquid. And if I say, I don't know if is it floating or floating? Rena, what is it? Because guys, English is not my first language. Sometimes I still get.
I think it's flooding, Flood. Yeah.
You say so beautiful. See, guys, I don't know, I can't. But you got the idea. So I'm gonna just fill in the whole thing. And I think I did too much on this side again, which is fine. You just get your boo-boo stick and just move around. You can find the Sweet Sugarbelle boo-boo stick that's much better than this one, Michael's. I can't find mine because all the reasons that I mentioned before. I don't know where to put my stuff now. Also, I'm moving a lot of things in the house, so I lost mine. See, maybe Michael's want to send me a new one. What do you guys think about that? Don't tell the boss, guys. I'm just joking. All right, so that is finished product. I mean, I usually wait a little bit and then I come here, make lines inside. So I'm gonna do that. Let this little thing dry a little bit. I'm putting those to the side because I have a fan here. Like I say, oops, sorry, but I have a fan there. So it dries better by the fan. And now we're gonna go back to the pink flower. And we already know how to make the leaf, right? So you can make always like a leaf with the same piping consistency lines and then fill in with the folding consistency. But I really love the effect of when you do the leaf like this. And you can do, since this leaf is big, you can think about two sides, right? Because the leaves usually have the middle of the leaf and one side, left side and right side. So let's think about like that. I'm gonna do like this, up and down, up and down. And I'm gonna do it again, up and down, and how that looks. I think it looks a little bit more realistic, don't you think? Okay, so I can't hear you guys, but I know you guys saying, yeah, it does look a little bit more real. Thank you. That what do you think over there, Emily? I see Emily is there looking, and I can see you. So let me go ahead and do the white part on the flower, which is makes a little bit more, looks like a rose. So and then you can do two ways. You can start from inside out. So I'm going to start from outside in. And if you don't have this little turning table, I would say buy one because it helps so much. How's that? It looks so cute. This is the one that we going by, and this one is the final result that we have. And you guys have any questions at this point?
No questions. I think they're mesmerized by the swirling and the circling and the twirling and that's that's the spot right there. Just spin it a little bit.
Yeah, right. No, not yet, right, guys? Not now. So this is the flower, that's the finished product. Let me just finish this little guy here, and I want to ask you guys now I need help. You guys gonna have to communicate somehow. What do you want to do next? You want to do Easter egg, or you want to do the bunny?
So somebody said do another, but go crazy. I don't know what they mean by crazy.
Go crazy?
Yeah.
With what? I can go crazy. That's easy for me, but I don't know if I can do that now.
Janice and Joyce vote bunny.
Bunny?
Carol votes bunny. Oh, artsy. Go crazy artsy on an egg.
Oh,
and Michelle wants to see the egg. Yeah.
Wow.
I think bunnies and eggs.
Well, so how many votes we have for the bunny, for the egg? Just one for the eggs, guys.
We have 2 for the egg, and I think 4 for the bunny. Okay,
so let's see. We're gonna try. Let's do the bunny and do the egg. I think we do have time. I think we do have.
Because it's only 4:26. But I'm sorry, I'm in a different time.
Yeah, whatever 26, whatever you are at is something 26. He is 126 in Arizona. Okay, so let's do the bunny. 2 colors. This one is a little bit different. I don't have the same colors now, but basically I think it looks cute when you outline one color and you fill in a different color. It looks cute. And this is a little fondant bowl. In this fondant bowl, I made using the fondant that is, I forgot the name. What is that again, Emily? This one that we have. Oh, This one is what I use, but you can use any fondant that you have. I was on a food sweet shop, but and I can show you guys. I just use a mold, which I misplaced for sure, but I use a little, just any little mold you can find. Michael's, they have a lot of molds. You can find any little mold, and it's easy for this mold, because I know some people may be like, how is that so 3D? That's not icing. So that's the trick part here. But even without the bowl, it looks cute. And the little part that you see, that is a little carrot, that is icing. So what I do is some things I pipe in advance. So this is for little flowers. So I pipe the center in the parchment paper and let them dry. And I save them. When I make the flower, I pipe the flower and I just drop this in the middle. Okay, I try to show you guys, but that makes your life so much easy, because you don't have to wait so much step to one thing to dry to come to the next, because this is already dry. Okay, and you can save these just like sprinkles. Same thing, the little carrot, and I can show if you guys want. This is super simple. Same thing, icing, and I put the little 2 little leaves that let dry and becomes a sprinkle. You can use in cookies or even cupcakes. Your imagination. So this is what this is. So let me try to go ahead now, and I'm gonna outline the little bunny. So now you know all the bunny secrets. And if you have any questions about any of the secrets of the bunnies, just ask and we see if we know. Rina knows a lot more about bunnies than me, I think. Let's see.
If you ask my 8-year-old, she knows a lot more about animals than I do. She's the one who watches all of those
oh my God,
Octonauts and Discovery Channel documentaries.
Oh my God, my daughter also likes animals a lot. She does. She loves animals, bugs. You can't kill a fly. Can't. She cried.
I had to give my daughter rules. I was like, you can catch bugs, but you're not allowed to catch the spiders.
Can you think about in Arizona? Because we heard about my daughter find what's that called? A scorpion.
Oh, yep.
That happened before. She tried to save the scorpion, and Jesus.
Yep.
Okay.
So Roni wants to know, do you let them dry on parchment paper?
Yeah, so anytime that I make those little transfers, I let them dry, maybe like from one night to the next day. And I just take them off and save them in little jars. You can make that in advance. It's super fun because you can make a little shapes. It's easy to make little apples, little carrots, pumpkins for fall. So
what type of frosting is best for that?
It's the same thing, royal icing.
Okay.
Yeah, we're doing all royal icing here. Yes, ma'am.
And Liz would like to know, can you show them how to do the flower on the bunny?
Which flower? Oh, this little flower here?
Maybe.
Which one you want to see? I try to make it if I know which one. Oh, the bowl? Yeah, so the bowl, I see that let's say the bowl. Oh. The bowl is fondant. I show you guys what I have. It's not, I don't know, this one is very old. I have this from Brazil many, many years ago. But you can find, like I say, Michael's, I know that they have bowls there because I've seen those. This is like a mold that you can get a little piece of fondant and you just press in, wait a couple of minutes, take it out, comes out. Just like that. It's an easy way to add details to your cookies. It's super easy.
Work smarter, not harder, right?
Yeah. No, not working. We already work hard a lot for things that we don't have any choice. So if you have a choice, go easy. I would say so.
Carol wants to know, what if the piping is breaking up when you're trying to apply it?
Which one?
If the piping, if it's breaking up, like when you're trying to apply it, is it a pressure thing? Do they need to add more?
Yes, that's the thing. So it depends. For me, when I'm doing the icing here, let me do this one in display. So I'm going here, right? I can go straight and just go like this, and it's gonna go all together. But if I see that I'm putting too much icing here, I might skip a space. See? because this way I feel like, oh, maybe I have to move this ice around because I put too much ice over there. So let's leave a little space in the middle, and then I'm gonna move this icing. So I don't know if that's what the question is, if that's like the piping that she was talking about, or if she's talking about, but now if she's talking about when she is outlining and it breaks, and then yes, it is depending on how much pressure you're doing. Let me just finish this one because I have to finish, and then I show the outlining thing. See, like you have to control your pressure. So sometimes also you're having a lot of pressure, you got to stop because you're putting too much ice, and you put less pressure, less ice comes out. You know, just like think about you having, I don't know, you have a water hose and try to water your plants outside. You know, you can control how much water is going out, you know, and then you have to see if you need more or not, you know, you have to close a little bit, open a little bit more. So when you press the icing, you're controlling how much icing is coming out and how much icing is, you know, is you don't want too much icing depending on what you're doing. So this little guy, he can dry, but let me just make the little dots. I'm gonna make in orange because that's the color that I have here. Basically, touch the cookie very quickly, and you have the little dots. Also, you can use sprinkles. Oh, I messed up one here. Also, you can use sprinkles. If you have sprinkles and you just use a sprinkle, you can also make a little dots, right? Just little circle sprinkles. I have done that many times. I think the last class that we did, we used the sprinkles to make dots. Something, I think. Okay, so that would be how you for this little bunny. And then if you have the bowl ready, you just put the bowl right here. I don't have another bowl ready because I wasn't sure if we were gonna get to that. Now, let me just, I don't wanna miss that question. I forget who made the question, but about the why is breaking. So when you're making the line, any line, you wanna make sure you keep the pressure always the same. It wasn't was that what, I just want to make sure that was the question, I think, if she can confirm that's what you're asking about the outlines, the piping.
Yeah, she said the piping, and like, what do you do if it keeps breaking? So I didn't know if that was a consistency question or a pressure question.
Right, I think both. And also technique, okay? Number one, when you put your ice inside the bag, make sure it's no air bubbles. Because if it's a big air bubble here, let's say, when I'm piping, at a certain point, the air is going to come out. You know, when the air comes out, it breaks my line, right? Because the air is coming out. Second thing is technique. Make sure you keep the pressure the same. The distance should be always kind of the same. Because if you're all over the place, you might as well, you know, might break it. I always recommend everybody, if you have the time, you know, I don't remember if Sugarbelle has on her website, but you can even Google icing, practicing papers that you can print and just practice the ice, the lines, the circles. I think I do have on my Instagram one saved on Julia's Cookies AZ, if you guys want to look later, Julia's with S Cookies with SAZ. And then I think I have one there, but you can practice the lines, the circles, the little dots, and maybe Sugarbelle also have one, I don't know. But basically, let's say, oh, look, I'm starting here, and I want to keep my pressure the same. As long as I don't have air inside my bag, and as long as I keep the same pressure, it should not break. See, not here, I'm making use of my little turntable. But imagine if I had air inside of this, it would break, right? Because the air want to come out. So, right? But so, number one, practicing. Icing is one of those things. A lot of people say, I can't make cookies. royal ice cookies, doesn't matter how many times you take a class, how many times I explain to you, the only way that you get good with royal ice is practicing. There's no way to do another way. I'm telling you, because for years, I want to learn, but I was lazy with making icing because I thought it was too much work. And I was like, I was lazy. And then once I started practicing, in 3 months, I got good on it, you know? And everybody works a little bit different with different consistencies. And so you got to find your own spot, right? Because I like to work with icing between 12 and 15 seconds. And some people like 20 seconds, you know? So everybody's different. So I would say practice your lines, practice your circles a lot, and the consistency. And that's the basic thing. Well, if you do that, I promise you're going to be better than us, you know, better than me, than any of people who is teaching classes. It's just like you got to do yourself and believe in yourself and keep trying. Okay. I hope that helps.
Yeah. And Jackie wants to know, for faster drying, are you able to place the cookies in the refrigerator for a few minutes?
No refrigerator. Good question. Thank God you asked for this, because refrigerator is horrible for icing. So what are you gonna do? Because icing doesn't like, remember I say air and water. Air and water, two enemies of icing. You don't want to put in refrigerator because it's humid. Okay, it's humid. It's gonna make your ice humid and it's gonna destroy your cookie. So what you can do is put it under the fan, or you can buy a machine. If you're making a lot of cookies, it's a machine called dehydrator that you can put your cookies there for a few minutes, maybe have an hour, and you know, you can't put too long and too hot, but that helps. Some people also leave the oven a little bit warm, just put the cookies inside the, I never done that, but I see people saying that works. So you put inside the oven, full disclaimer, I never done it. But you make the oven a little warm, put the cookies inside, leave the door open, and let the icing dry that way. But I would say the fan, under the fan is the best way. If you go professional, you're making a lot of cookies, buy a dehydrator, okay? Any more questions? I think I saw a question there.
Yeah, Carol wants to know, when you're making the frosting, do you add the flour 1 tablespoon at a time?
The frosting, the royal icing?
Yeah.
The royal icing takes powdered sugar, confectionery powdered sugar.
Do you have the water 1 tablespoon at a time too?
I just put the whole bag of sugar in a mixer. I put my meringue powder and I add water little by little. So if the recipe calls for a quarter, like let's say a half cup of water, for example, depending on how much you're making, I put half of it, mix some, and then I add water little by little. Because remember, you can always add more water, but you can't remove the water. So put a little by little, right? So I try to make first my icing very thick, very, you know, pipe consistency. And then I take some, put in a bowl, separate, cover, and then I add more water to the mixer. So this way I work 1 time. I don't have to do twice, because who likes to wash dishes? Nobody. So that's how I do it. I hope that answers. If not, you can type the more questions, guys.
Liz wants to know, how do you store your cookies after decorating, and how long do they last?
Great question. So once they go fully dry, I usually bag them, you know, putting bags, like each cookie in a bag. I don't sell cookies anymore. When I used to sell cookies, that's why I used to bag them all, heat seal the cookies, and then they last for a long time, maybe 2 weeks even. If you're not doing that, you can put in a Ziploc bag. You can even freeze your cookies. Not refrigerator, but freezer is a dry cold, right? So you can put in Ziploc bags and you can freeze that. When you're ready to eat, you take it out, leave on a counter in your kitchen until you get to room temperature. Let's say it's for tomorrow, right? You take it tonight, leave on a counter, and tomorrow you can consume. And if you freeze, you can freeze for 2-3 months, you know? So that's all you can do. Okay. So questions, all great questions, by the way. And so we're gonna, let me try to, for this egg, I'm gonna just, let me just do a little design here. I'm gonna do another one here. I think this ice is a little bit, I should cut this smaller, but it's gonna work. But that's why it's good to have the tip, right? Because you know exactly what is the thickness that's gonna come out. Let me just do this one. So with Easter eggs, I always feel like it's whatever you wanna do because so many ways to decorate differently. Let me do this one like that. Now I'm gonna do this one in pink. All right, so. And I could have all the colors, but honestly, I forgot to make it the colors. And so now, what is the, oh, the red, okay. Now, let's say we're gonna make little red dots here. With a nice way to decorate eggs with sprinkles, as I mentioned before. I'm gonna finish this one with my orange. You can do any color that you want, like, I don't even know, I'm liking orange lately. I don't even know why. Never liked orange before. Maybe it's the baby. Same thing, I don't drink coffee anymore and I love coffee, but the baby doesn't like coffee. So maybe the baby likes orange, I don't know. Here we go. So this is another way, right? And I'm gonna change this piping icing. I was supposed to have a bag here, but I don't. Sorry guys, give me 1 second. Okay, I got a bag now. So I'm just gonna change because I thought the whole my bag was too big for what I'm gonna try to do next. So I'm changing, put inside on the bag. And I'm gonna get a little one this time. If you wanna use a chip for that, it's gonna be like size 1, which is very, very thin. So for this one now, I'm gonna have to let this egg dry for a little bit. Let's go back to this other flower that I forgot about it, to be honest. But nobody else can remind me either. And that one.
Bill wanted to know, do you use vegetable glycerin?
Huh?
Vegetable glycerin?
Glycerin for the icing?
Yeah, I think.
You can use it. So I usually use I put a little bit glycerin on my icing. This one doesn't have any glycerin, to be honest. But so you can use glycerin on your, maybe like a spoon for 2 bags of sugar. And the glycerin is gonna help your icing dry, not too hard. So, remember like when you go sometimes to a store, if you went to Disney, you know what I'm talking about. The icing on the cookies so dry, that's like a rock. So if you use glycerin, the icing never gets very hard in the middle. So when you bite between the cookie and the top layer, it's gonna be a little bit soft. So the glycerin helps with that. So it's not something necessary, but it is a good, I think it's a good thing to do it. When I used to sell cookies, I used to do that all the time because people go, oh, your cookies are not so dry, not so hard, And so, yeah, glycerin helps with the consistency of the icing. And but it's not a deal breaker, but if you have, use it. I like it.
And Emily wants to know if you can show us a wet on wet dragging design.
Oh yeah, good idea. Yeah, sure. So let me just go outline this flower because I touched the flower edge there. It's my fault. It was not the fan or anything, but I touched the wrong place. So I like to go like this. Just want to finalize this one because I feel like, you know, we left the thing unfinished. Okay. So that would be the final product for this little flower. The final product for this little flower. Okay, the 2 little flowers. And if you know how to do those flowers, it's already impressive for people. You know, if someone who never made cookie, they get so impressed with, you know, even simple, cute designs like that, you know? And I think they look good. And I saw a question, but I couldn't read because.
Yeah, they said, how do you tie the icing bag? Because whenever they do it, their icing spills out.
Okay. It's one of those things that more you do, more you get practice. So I usually just make sure I like roll like this and then I tie it in. I know it's a lot of people not able to do it, so you can use these little things. This is from the Sweet Sugarbelle line as well. That helps you tie. But basically it's just practice, like anything else with icing. It's like you have with royal icing and all the little things involved with icing cookies, you gotta be persistent, you gotta keep trying. But if you not get it yet how to tie, this helps you a lot. But try, keep trying. I know it takes a little bit of time to get the bag tied. Also, don't put too much icing for 2 reasons. It's difficult to tie, and also it's gonna destroy your hand, because if you make a lot of icing, you don't need to hold a big bag. So make a smaller bag is easy to tie. Any question? Any other question?
So Liz wants to know, how do you get your icing so shiny? She says hers dries dull.
Fan. That's what I say in the beginning. The fan makes your icing dry shiny. If you don't put your icing under the fan, you can do whatever you want. It's not going to be shiny. So the first few minutes, as soon as you pipe your cookie, put under the fan. Not very hot, you know, it's not going to be so, it doesn't have to be a lot, but you need a source of air on the top of the icing. The first layer of ice that is drying is going to dry very shiny if you have a source of air. Okay, either the fan or the dehydrator, whatever. That helps. The questions? Any other questions?
Not at the moment.
All right. So I have this little cookie here, the little flower. Let's try to make the wet on wet. I love wet on wet technique. I just have this small one here. I don't have any big one available right now here, but this one's going to show us. So we're going to over the whole cookie. See, I put too much ice on this side, so that's why I'm dragging the other way, because I don't want to overflow the cookie. And so let's say we're gonna do, I think that's what she meant, like one of the wet on wet that we can use. I'm not gonna make too much lines because it's gonna overflow. So let's say we can do like this, right? And just keep doing swirls like that. I know this is not the best color, guys, but that was not. So if you do swirls like that, and then, like I say, I usually have, let me get a little, it's easier that way. Something to put a little yellow center. And then you just put it under the fan. So this is a little, a way to do this, the wet on wet. You can do wet on wet so many ways. Like this is wet on wet, right? The little dots that we did here are also wet on wet. So let's say if you want to make different colors, you can make 3 lines and then you swirl like this, go up and down, and you get a nice effect. You can play, I love wet on wet because you can play so many different ways and create so many different things. You know, that's a great idea. I don't know if that was exactly what you want to see. I just don't have a big cookie enough here. I mean, I could use the other side of the little bunny. But you know, the same thing, the as long as you can drag. And I would say if you're doing the lines, it's nice to use 2 different colors of the lines. And then you're going to swirl this way. And I'm sorry, I just don't have, that was not on the class schedule, but I don't mind talking about. I just don't have, I wish I had a bigger cookie to show more wet on wet, but was not one of the things that we have on the class, so that's why. But I want to show you guys the bunny, because that I can do here. Not the bunny, I have some paper here that I can the sprinkle. I don't have a lot because I did not. I just want to show you how to make, let's say if you're going to have more paper than this. I hope so. I hope you have more passionate paper than I do. So you're going to have to make the little sprinkle. It's super easy. You're just going to start from the top, whatever size you want, and move down, release the pressure. This one did not come very long. And then with the other, the piping, the other pipe consistency, you can make the leaves. This one didn't come too cute, but so let's say you make the leaves. This one is a little bit too big, but that's how you do it. So you make little carrots like that, and you let them dry. And when they dry, they come out of the parchment paper, and then just you have that. That's what I was talking about. And you can make a bunch of them in advance. And so the circle, the same thing. So the flower that we just did, same thing. Let's say this is the circle, but for the circle, you just make a dot and keep piping the same place, and the release. And that's it. You're not gonna make it like a round like that. You just go on a spot and just press. Let that little circle build up. And then you fix the little circle as much as you want. He's not being so small paper, so that's why it's difficult. Usually it's not that difficult. The paper is a little bit bigger. And let dry, and then you can transfer. That's it. I guess that's basically what I have to show you guys, unless if you guys have any more questions. I hope if you guys have any questions, you can always tell me now. Is there any other questions there?
I am not seeing any, but they do like the wet on wet. They think they're gorgeous designs.
Oh yeah, I mean, it could have a whole full class of wet on wet because there's so much you can do, right? And but yeah, well, you guys can tell Michael, don't say I say. Is that on camera? Oh God, that's on camera. I always do that. Can you delete that, Raina?
I can't, but I won't tell anybody, I promise.
Okay. I always get myself in trouble, guys. Yeah, and that's it. I mean, I'm so happy to answer all the questions. I know it's not a lot of time. And that's why I tell you guys to, if you guys have Instagram, you can always go to Julia's Cookies AZ. Ask me questions, and if I try to answer everything that I can. I always post tutorials for people, like it's all free. You guys don't have to pay anything, which is great. Great for you. And for your bag, you put your backpack. No, what's that called? What is that called? For wallet? Yes, your wallet. Almost forgot. But I'd be happy to answer any questions. Also, like I said, Sweet Sugarbelle, she have great resources that everybody, all the professionals look at. And I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope see you guys the next time. Thank you so much. Rena, anything else that we have?
Nope, other than if you guys do make some beautiful cookies, please do share them on social media. And be sure to hashtag or tag or whatever you can do so that we see them and so that Julia sees them and sees how much you guys learned from her.
Yes, tag us and send me hello, send me messages, and let me know when you guys come to Arizona, okay?
But avoid the scorpions.
avoid. No, don't go close. They're dangerous.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.